It is the early hours of the 2nd of March, 1980. Inside a small police station in Ukiah, California, a teenage boy sits across from a desk sergeant. He is 14 years old, slightly built, wearing the kind of look in his eyes that takes a long time to understand, somewhere between exhaustion and relief, somewhere between a child and a man. Beside him is a 5-year-old boy clinging to his arm, barely awake. The officer asks the teenager for his name. There is a pause, a long one, and then the boy picks up a pen, and in unsteady handwriting, across a plain piece of paper, he begins to write the most heartbreaking sentence anyone in that building had ever read. My name is Steven Stayner. I am 14 years of age. I don't know my true birth date, but I use the 18th of April, 1965. I know my first name is Steven. I'm pretty sure my last is Stayner. And if I have a middle name, I don't know it. He didn't know his own last name. He wasn't sure of his own birthday. He had been gone for 7 years, 3 months, and 26 days. And in that moment, when the officer looked across the desk at that hollow-eyed boy with the younger child pressed against his side, something clicked into place, something almost impossible to comprehend. This teenager, who had just walked into a police station in the middle of the night carrying a 5-year-old he barely knew, had once been a missing child himself. And the reason he finally came back, had nothing to do with himself. He came back to save someone else. Quick question before we continue. Are you one of those people who listens to true crime while cooking, driving, cleaning, or are you fully locked in right now, lights dimmed, volume up? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I want to know who's staying up way too late solving mysteries with me. If you're already hooked by what you just heard, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week we go this deep into real cases, real people, and real stories that deserve to be told. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Merced, California, in 1972, was the kind of town that most of America imagined when it thought about the American dream. A farming community nestled in the Central Valley, surrounded by almond groves and peach orchards, framed by the distant blue shadow of Yosemite National Park. It was a town where people left their doors unlocked, where kids rode bikes until sunset without a parent giving it a second thought, where the biggest danger most children ever faced was getting in trouble for coming home late for dinner. Stephen Gregory Stayner was born on the 18th of April, 1965. The third of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner. He had an older brother, Cary, and 3 younger sisters. The Stayner family wasn't wealthy, but they were present a mother who kept the house and the children, a father who worked hard, a table around which a family gathered. By any ordinary measure, it was a good life. Stephen himself was 7 years old in the winter of 1972. By all accounts, he was an unremarkable little boy in all the best ways, curious, social, the kind of kid who made friends easily and filled a room with noise. His teachers liked him. His classmates liked him. He was spunky. People who knew him said you could see that he wanted to play and be with kids and be normal. He was, in every way, a regular 7-year-old living a regular life in a regular town. And that ordinariness, that beautiful, precious ordinariness, is exactly what makes what happened to him so unbearable to look at directly. It was a sleety, wintry day. The 4th of December, 1972, a Monday. Stephen had just finished school and was walking the short distance home along Highway 140, the same route he had taken dozens of times before. He was a few blocks from his house. He would have been home in minutes. That is when a man named Irvin Edward Murphy approached him on the sidewalk. Murphy was handing out religious pamphlets. He was soft-spoken, polite, and presented himself as a representative of a church collecting donations for charitable causes. Murphy asked Stephen if he thought his mother would have anything to donate. When Stephen answered that she would, he naively climbed into the man's car. Murphy said they would drive him home and talked to his mom about the donation. It seemed reasonable. It seemed safe. Steven was 7. He got in the car. The driver was a man named Kenneth Eugene Parnell. He was not a minister. He was not a man of God. He was, at that moment, one of the most dangerous men in California, a convicted sex offender with a history of crimes against children stretching back to the early 1950s. Parnell had already served time for raping a child and impersonating a police officer. He had moved through the country like a shadow, always one step ahead of accountability, always landing in a new place with a new story and a new face to present to the world. By 1972, he was working as a night auditor at the Yosemite Lodge. He had convinced Murphy, who was described by many as a simple-minded man easily led, that he was an aspiring minister who wanted to help raise a young boy. Murphy believed him. That is the terrifying architecture of what happened next. It did not require a gun. It did not require a van with blacked-out windows. It required a pamphlet, a sentence about donations, and a man who knew exactly how to speak to a child. The car did not go toward the Stayner house. It turned onto the highway and kept moving. Kenneth Parnell stopped the car and went to a payphone. He came back and told Steven, "Your parents, I just spoke to them. They no longer want you." Think about that. Try to hold that sentence in your hands and feel how heavy it is. A 7-year-old boy sitting in the back of a stranger's car, somewhere on a highway in Central California, being told by a man he just met that his own parents had given him away. That they had decided over a phone call that they didn't want him anymore. Steven cried. Of course he cried. And Parnell was there to comfort him, to tell him it was okay, to position himself as the adult who would now take care of him. The cabin Parnell drove him to was in Cathy's Valley, in Mariposa County, located only several hundred feet from Steven's maternal grandfather's residence, though Steven would have had no way of knowing that. The irony of that geography is almost too cruel to name. His family was geographically almost within reach, and yet Steven Stayner would not go home for 7 years. That first night, inside that cabin, Kenneth Parnell committed the first of countless sexual assaults against a 7-year-old child. The abuse began immediately. It escalated over the first few weeks and continued for years. And Steven was given a new name. From that night forward, he was Dennis Gregory Parnell. Back in Merced, the Stayner family waited and waited. Cary Stayner called the school. She called the neighbors. She called everyone who might have seen her son, retracing the route he should have walked, asking at every door. When night fell and Steven had not come home, Delbert and Kay called the police. The investigation began quickly, at least on paper. Flyers went up across Merced County. A reward was offered. Tips poured in. The community, as small towns do, rallied around the family. People who had never met the Stayners showed up to search, to help, to hold vigil. Newspaper headlines across California ran the story. Vast hunt on for missing Merced boy. Merced boy still missing. By Christmas, the story had not faded. A headline from the Los Angeles Times that December read simply, "Stevie's Yule gifts still unopened." That detail is the one that breaks you. The presents, wrapped and waiting beneath a tree, for a child who was not there to open them. His parents kept all the presents their son never got to open, after going missing a few weeks before Christmas in 1972. They kept them, because hope for a parent is not a feeling. It is a decision you make every single morning when you wake up and choose to believe your child is still alive. Cary Stayner made that decision every day for 7 years, but the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses, no forensic leads, no meaningful trace. Murphy had vanished back into Parnell's orbit. Parnell himself had no local profile. He worked at Yosemite Lodge, far from Merced, and had given police nothing to follow. In 1972, the systems that exist today to track sex offenders, to cross-reference prior convictions with missing children cases, simply did not exist in any meaningful way. Police realized later that Parnell had previous convictions of sodomy, but had never registered as a sex offender and had never been suspected of anything in connection with the Stayner disappearance. A child vanished from a town in broad daylight, and the man who took him kept working his job at a national park lodge, driving that same white Buick, paying his rent, going to the grocery store. He was, to anyone who looked, just a man living an ordinary life. And he had Steven. The years moved, the way years do when grief becomes the weather, constantly present, occasionally piercing, mostly a kind of dull grey weight. The Stayner family changed in ways that families who lose a child always change. Delbert swung between all-consuming efforts to find his missing son and suicidal depression. He was so bereft when Steven was taken that he pushed Cary away, saying his real son was gone. Sit with that. Delbert Stayner, in his grief, told his other son, his 10-year-old boy, his firstborn, that his real son was gone. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of a kind of devastation so total that it eclipsed everything else. Cary Stayner, watching his family collapse around the absence of his younger brother, carried that wound in silence. What it grew into would not become clear for nearly 3 decades, but it was growing. Meanwhile, 30-some miles away, Steven Stayner was going to school. That is one of the strangest facts of this entire story. Parnell enrolled him. He moved them frequently, from Cathays Valley to various locations across California, eventually settling in Mendocino County, and at each stop he sent Steven to local public school. Steven was enrolled under a fake identity, Dennis Parnell, and attended school while Kenneth Parnell publicly raised him as his son and sexually abused him behind closed doors. Steven made friends. He had a personality that drew people to him, a warmth, a naturalness that survival could not entirely strip away. A girl named Laurie Duke, who dated Steven in high school but knew him as Dennis, said he had a great personality. She said he was spunky, that you could see he wanted to play and be with kids and be normal. Nobody at school knew. Not one person, not one teacher, not one student, not one parent of a classmate who might have looked at Dennis Parnell and thought something was wrong. That speaks to something deeply uncomfortable about how abuse operates when it is conducted inside the structure of a family or a fake one. The performance of normalcy is the mechanism of concealment. Dennis went to school, came home, did homework, played with other kids, and behind closed doors, Kenneth Parnell did what he had always done. For a period of 18 months, a woman named Barbara Mathias lived with Parnell and Stayner. According to Stayner, Mathias, along with Parnell, raped him on 9 occasions at age 9. Mathias later claimed she was completely unaware that Dennis had been kidnapped. She was never arrested. The years passed. Steven turned 8, 9, 10, 11. He passed through puberty under Parnell's watch. And as Steven grew older, the dynamic began to shift, because the thing that made Steven valuable to Parnell, the thing that motivated Parnell's entire twisted architecture, was Steven's age. And age, unlike everything else, cannot be controlled. As Steven got older and entered puberty, Parnell's sexual interest in Steven waned, and Parnell sought a new boy to build his family. So he began grooming Steven to help him find one. There were attempts, failed attempts. Parnell would instruct Steven to lure children to help create an opportunity for abduction. And here is where the story quietly pivots into something that requires you to understand the psychology of what 7 years of manipulation does to a child's sense of self and reality. Steven had grown up inside Parnell's control. He had been brainwashed, abused, and isolated from any frame of reference other than the one Parnell had constructed for him. He called Parnell Dad. He had not seen his real family since he was 7 years old. And yet Stayner revealed later that he had intentionally sabotaged every kidnapping attempt Parnell sent him on. He was protecting other children, while living inside the architecture of his own abuse, with no model for what resistance looked like and no external support of any kind. Steven Stayner found a way to quietly, invisibly fight back. Parnell, furious at what he saw as incompetence, eventually stopped using Steven as an accomplice. He found another way. The 14th of February, 1980, Valentine's Day. In Cary, California, a 5-year-old boy named Timothy White was walking with his older brother near their home when Kenneth Parnell, with the help of a teenager named Randall Sean Porman, whom Parnell paid with $50, marijuana, and alcohol, kidnapped 5-year-old Timmy White. Timmy was brought back to the one-room cabin where Parnell lived with Steven. Parnell dyed the younger boy's hair brown. He introduced him as the newest member of the family. Steven Stayner was 14 years old now. He had been living this nightmare for 7 years. He had adapted to it, survived it, built a life of sorts inside it. He had friends, a girlfriend, a degree of freedom Parnell granted him because he believed, after all this time, that Steven would never run. Parnell trusted him. That was the mistake. Because the moment Steven saw Timmy White, 5 years old, terrified, crying for his parents in a one-room cabin in the middle of nowhere, something crystallized inside him. Something that no amount of brainwashing or manipulation could extinguish. Later, Steven would describe it simply. "I couldn't see Timmy suffer," he told Newsweek in 1984. "It was my do-or-die chance, and I also would be coming home for doing something positive." He had lived through 7 years of abuse. He had sabotaged kidnapping attempts. He had survived. And now, staring at a 5-year-old who was about to endure everything he had endured, Steven Stayner made a decision. He was going to take Timmy White home. Even if it meant he couldn't go home himself, even if it meant everything fell apart, even if he had to carry that child on his back. The night of the 1st of March 1980, while Kenneth Parnell was away at his night shift job, Steven woke Timmy up. He told him they were leaving. Carrying Timmy on his back, Steven hitchhiked 40 miles to Ukiah. Think about that image. A 14-year-old boy, in the dark, on the side of a California highway, with a 5-year-old on his back, hitchhiking toward a town he barely knew, toward a police station he wasn't sure existed, toward a future he couldn't begin to imagine. He didn't know what would happen to him. He didn't know if his family would recognize him. He didn't even know if anyone was still looking. He just walked, and carried Timmy, and kept walking. When they finally arrived at the Ukiah Police Department, in the early hours of the 2nd of March 1980, the desk officer looked at the two boys with confusion. The officer was suspicious of the older boy at first, and brought them both inside. And it was there that Steven eventually told his story. When asked to write his name, Steven picked up that pen and wrote those words that would become perhaps the most emotionally resonant sentence in the history of American crime. "I know my first name is Steven. Not his last name, not his birthday, not his address, or the name of his school, or the face of his mother. 7 years of a man's systematic dismantling of a child's identity. And what remained, what Parnell could not touch, was this: Steven. He knew he was Steven." By daybreak on March 2, Kenneth Parnell had been arrested on suspicion of abducting both boys. Police checked into his background and found a previous sodomy conviction from 1951. He had been right there, hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. Both children were reunited with their families that same day. Cary Stayner, speaking to reporters who flocked to Merced, California on the day of Steven's return, said, "This is really so phenomenal. For a child to be gone 7 years and to be found alive. We expected him to come back. We had hope, faith, and kept busy. I never did lose my hope that I would find Steve. And Del Stayner, his voice heavy with 7 years of searching, told the press, "I never stopped looking every time I saw a crowd on TV or a picture of a lot of people in a magazine. I always looked very closely in hopes of spotting Steven. They had kept his Christmas gifts unopened for 7 years. America wept. The story consumed the national news cycle. Steven Stayner was called a hero, and he was genuinely, completely, unambiguously a hero. A 14-year-old child who had survived the unsurvivable and had chosen, at the moment of his escape, to think of someone smaller than himself first. Timothy White, at 14 years old, served as one of the pallbearers at Steven's funeral years later. Some bonds, forged in the worst circumstances imaginable, never break. But the story was not over. Not even close. The trial of Kenneth Parnell moved swiftly by the standards of the early 1980s. Parnell was tried and convicted in 1981 of kidnapping both White and Stayner in 2 separate trials. The courtroom heard some of what had happened in those cabins over those years, though not all of it. Steven himself refused to disclose everything. He was 14. He had already given more than anyone should have to give. The sentence handed down by the court was, by any measure of justice, catastrophic. 7 years. That was the maximum penalty allowable under California law at the time for kidnapping. 7 years for abducting 2 children, for 7 years of systematic sexual abuse of a 7-year-old boy. For the kind of sustained psychological destruction that would shadow everyone connected to this story for the rest of their lives, Parnell was sentenced to 7 years, but was paroled after serving 5. 5 years. The public outcry was immediate and fierce, but the law was the law. Murphy, who had lured Steven into the car, received 5 years and was paroled after 2. Parnell walked out of prison in the mid-1980s, while Steven Stayner was still trying to figure out how to be a person again. Parnell was not charged with the numerous sexual assaults on Stayner and other boys, because most of them occurred outside the jurisdiction of the Merced County prosecutor, or were by then outside the statute of limitations. The Mendocino County prosecutors decided, almost entirely on their own, not to pursue the sexual assault charges that fell within their jurisdiction. The reasoning was never made entirely clear to the public. The result was unmistakable. The man who had spent 7 years raping a child he had kidnapped faced no criminal consequence for those acts, none. Stayner's kidnapping and its aftermath prompted California lawmakers to change state laws to allow consecutive prison terms in similar abduction cases. That is something. That is not enough, but it is something. Coming home should have been the end of the nightmare. For the Stayner family, for Steven, for the nation that had followed his story with held breath, the 2nd of March 1980 felt like a miracle, like closure, like the moment a terrible chapter ends and the rest of the story can finally begin. But trauma does not follow narrative structure. It doesn't resolve cleanly. It doesn't know how to be a happy ending. After returning to his family, Stayner had trouble adjusting to a more structured household, as he had been allowed to smoke, drink, and do as he pleased when he lived with Parnell. In an interview with Newsweek shortly after his escape, Stayner said, "I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. That quote deserves to be read twice. I returned almost a grown man, and yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. He had aged. He had grown through years of abuse into a teenager with habits, a personality formed in captivity, a sense of self constructed without the guidance of a family, and his parents, understandably, were trying to reconnect with the child they had lost. The gap between those two realities, who Steven was and who they needed him to be, was enormous. Stayner underwent brief counseling but never sought additional treatment. He also refused to disclose all the details of the sexual abuse he endured from Parnell. In a 2007 interview, Stayner's sister said that her brother did not seek counseling because their father said he didn't need any. She added, "He got on with his life, but he was pretty messed up. He was bullied at school. Other children, unable to process or contain what had happened to him, directed cruelty at him for the abuse he had suffered, as if it was something he had chosen. He was teased so much over the sexual abuse he endured that he eventually dropped out. Things at home grew increasingly strained. He began drinking. Eventually, things got so bad that he was kicked out of the family home. His relationship with his father remained troubled for years. And yet, he found a life. He built one. In 1985, he married a 17-year-old named Jody Edmondson. They had 2 children together, a daughter named Ashley and a son named Steven Jr. He worked odd jobs, spoke to children's groups about personal safety, gave interviews when he was asked about his experience. He tried to use what had happened to him to protect others. He worked with child abduction organizations. He was, in the language of redemption narratives, healing. In 1989, a television miniseries aired about his story. It was called I Know My First Name is Steven. It reached an average audience of 35.8 million viewers over 2 nights and was described by critics as a rare exception, a made-for-TV true crime story that treated its subject with dignity. The Los Angeles Times TV critic called the production an exception to the usual exercises in distortion and exploitation that characterize dramatizations of horrific crimes. Steven Stayner was 24 years old when the miniseries aired. He met the actors who played him. He sat for interviews. He was, by all accounts, doing better. Things were improving. The darkness was not gone, but the light was visible. On the 16th of September 1989, 6 months after the miniseries aired, Steven Stayner was riding his motorcycle in Merced when he was struck by a car. He died that night. He was 24 years old. He was buried beside his grandparents in Merced District Cemetery. 450 people attended his funeral. Timothy White, 14 years old. The boy Steven had carried on his back across 40 miles of dark highway 9 years earlier, was one of the pallbearers. There is no way to write that sentence without pausing afterward. No way to move past it cleanly. A 24-year-old man who had survived kidnapping, years of sexual abuse, reintegration into a family that didn't know how to hold him, public cruelty, alcoholism, estrangement, and the whole vast machinery of trauma dead on a road in the town where he was born before he ever got to see who he might become. If the story ended there, it would already be one of the most devastating in modern American history. But it doesn't end there, because the Stayner family was not finished. While Steven had been living his 7 years in captivity, his older brother Cary had been living his own kind of hell at home. He was the kid left behind, the brother whose absence defined the family. There was a pall over Cary because he was the kid who had his brother kidnapped. His father had told him his real son was gone. His parents had collapsed into grief. The house was haunted. Cary was described as a bit of a creepy loner. He had no interest in girls, no close friendships, and no ability to develop interpersonal relationships. He was, by accounts from those who knew him, deeply troubled in ways that were becoming visible but were never fully addressed. His sister, Cary Stayner, would later say, Cary was unwell since he was a toddler, as far as I know. The thoughts and fantasies that consumed him preceded Steven's kidnapping when Cary was 11, and his own sexual victimization by his uncle, which happened about 6 months thereafter. Cary Stayner had been victimized too, in ways the family did not fully disclose. He grew up in a house riven with dysfunction, grief, and a specific kind of emotional abandonment that a child without resources cannot survive intact. He moved to Yosemite. He worked as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel. He was pleasant enough to co-workers. He seemed, on the surface, like a quiet, harmless man working a service job in a beautiful national park. In February 1999, nearly 2 decades after Steven walked into that police station, the bodies of 3 female tourists began appearing near Yosemite. Carol Sund, her teenage daughter Julie, and their friend Silvina Pelosso had gone missing and were found murdered. The investigation dragged. No clear suspect emerged. And then, in July 1999, a young park naturalist named Joey Armstrong was found decapitated near her cabin. Police learned about an international scout that had been spotted at the cabin around the time Armstrong died. Detectives traced the vehicle to Cary Stayner. During questioning, he confessed to killing Armstrong and to the killings of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Pelosso months earlier. Investigators realized, in that interrogation room, why the name Stayner felt familiar. Cary was the brother of Steven Stayner, kidnapped by a pedophile in 1972, forced to change his name to Dennis and held captive for years, until one night in 1980, when he walked into a police station and said, "I know my first name is Steven." The Stayner family. One family. One missing child who came home traumatized and died at 24. One older brother who witnessed it all and became a serial killer. One set of parents who kept Christmas presents unopened for 7 years, who never stopped looking, who tried to love their children through the impossible. It is, as one journalist put it, almost Shakespearean in the depth of its tragedy. It's a lot to imagine that any one family could undergo, said Jessica Dimmock, director of the Hulu docuseries Captive Audience, a real American horror story. The worst thing that could possibly happen happens to them. And what of Kenneth Parnell? He walked out of prison in the mid-1980s, served his 5 years, and disappeared back into the anonymous fabric of California life. Nobody was watching him with particular urgency. The laws hadn't yet caught up to what he was. And so he continued. He kept looking. He kept wanting. In January 2003, in a cluttered apartment in Berkeley, a 71-year-old man named Kenneth Parnell, by then disabled, requiring near-constant nursing care, ravaged by diabetes and emphysema, and the aftermath of a stroke, approached his caregiver's relative and offered to pay her $500 to purchase a 4-year-old boy for him. Parnell was arrested again. The prosecution argued their case before the jury by showing a slideshow, a photograph of Steven Stayner marked 1, a photograph of Timothy White marked 2, and a blank screen marked 3, to show the non-existent child that would have been abducted had police not been notified. The prosecutor, Tim Wellman, said during closing arguments Parnell was looking for one last hurrah, one last Steven Stayner, one last Timmy White. Parnell was convicted on the 9th of February 2004 on charges of attempting to purchase a child and attempted child molestation. He was sentenced to 25 years to life under California's 3 strikes law. He never left prison again. Kenneth Eugene Parnell died on the 21st of January 2008 at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. He was 76 years old. He died in a prison hospital, old and broken and diminished. That is not the same as justice. Nothing about this story is clean enough to be called justice, but it is the closest this case will ever come. There are things in this story that linger, that resist the comfortable closure of a documentary ending. Steven Stayner never got the counseling he needed. His father told him he didn't need it, and Steven, trained by years of someone else's control to comply with the adults around him, agreed. He spent years bullied and struggling and reaching for something that kept slipping away. He died at 24, just as his life was beginning to look like it might hold. The Stayner family asked, years later, for a park in Merced to be named in Steven's honor. The council declined, in fear that the community would associate the park with another Stayner Stevens' older brother and convicted serial killer, Cary Stayner. Steven Stayner, who saved a 5-year-old boy's life at the cost of his own safety and comfort, could not get a park named after him because of his brother's crimes. The things that happen to this family radiate outward in every direction you look. The abandonment of Cary, the silence around Steven's abuse, the institutional failure that allowed Parnell to molest a child for 7 years while working a normal job and enrolling his victim in public school, the sentencing structure that gave him 5 years and let him walk free, while Steven's life continued to fracture, the culture of 1970s and 1980s California that told Steven, implicitly and explicitly, that what had happened to him was shameful rather than something done to him. None of it was inevitable. Every single point of failure had a human hand in it. What this story asks of us, what it has always asked, since that night in 1980, when a 14-year-old boy carried a 5-year-old into a police station in the dark, is not just grief. Grief is easy. Grief lets us feel something without being changed by it. What this story asks is something harder. It asks us to look at the systems that failed Steven Stayner. The neighbors who never questioned Dennis Parnell. The teachers who saw nothing. The prosecutors who declined to file charges. The father who told his son he didn't need help. The laws that prioritize legal technicality over protection. It asks us to look at all of that and ask what we are doing differently now. And in some ways, we are doing things differently. Megan's Law, mandatory sex offender registries, the Adam Walsh Act, the many pieces of legislation that were shaped, in part, by cases exactly like this one. California changed its laws on consecutive prison terms in abduction cases directly as a result of Steven Stayner's case. His story did not disappear into history, it pushed. But no law can undo what was done to Steven. No legislation can give him back the 7 years, or the next 14, or the full life he should have lived. What remains, after everything, is that sentence. Written in the early hours of the 2nd of March, 1980, by a 14-year-old boy who didn't know his own birthday or his own last name, but who held on to, through everything, through 7 years of someone trying to erase him one single essential fact. I know my first name is Steven. He knew who he was. They could not take that from him. And in the end, knowing who he was is what brought him home and what brought Timmy White home with him. That is who Steven Stayner was. Not just a victim, not just a statistic. A boy from Merced, California, who loved to play and be with kids and be normal, who was taken at 7 years old, who survived the unsurvivable, and who, when he finally had the chance to walk away from all of it, reached back instead and grabbed a 5-year-old's hand. That is the whole story. And it deserves to be remembered. If this video moved you, if you stayed to the end, if this story stayed with you, please like this video and subscribe. This is the kind of real human storytelling I bring you every week. Hit the bell so you never miss a new case. And leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this story hit you hardest, or if there's a case you want me to cover next. I read every single one. Steven Stayner, born the 18th of April, 1965, died the 16th of September, 1989, 24 years old. He knew his first name. He knew who he was, and we should too.